Okay. Okie dokie. Welcome. We're doing prep today for Wednesday office hours. And the article I chose is yet another thing on labor theory of value. And this one in particular is uses critical realism, a critical realism, or version of it, to articulate the kind of the theory of the labor theory of value. And that's actually more important to do that at the front end, to sort of work through what the problems are. And we'll see how this goes. All righty. Hmm. So this paper uses critical realism to reflect upon the issue of theory in Marx's labor theory of value, or LTV. Like any theory, the LTV is rooted in a mode of theorization. Rooting the LTV in an inappropriate or deductivist mode of theorization encourages the formulation of quantitative versions of the LTV that A, have severe problems, and B, lack explanatory power. Let me break here for a second and say the severe problems on the qualitative side, um, well, we'll see in a second. A, have severe problems, and B, lack explanatory power. Conversely, rooting the LTV in an appropriate, as in terms of a causal explanatory mode, encourages the formulation of qualitative versions of the LTV that A, lack such problems, and B, have explanatory power. So you see, there's a kind of inversion here between sort of a demand to make something work that can work in a kind of quantitative and empirical way, and gain explanatory power. So it's kind of they seem to be together, but they're not. They're really kind of working at cross purposes, because sort of in between all of this is a kind of interpretive problem. So now, if you can follow that, it's the reason why critical realism is useful. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other problem uh, with theories of critical realism, so we won't go there, or we'll go there eventually, probably. But uh, at this particular stage of looking at value, we're not, we don't have to sort of rehearse or tread over, repeat the kinds of problems that come with a labor theory of value. And in fact, it's probably better that we don't. And so we'll just tackle this as it is, and see whether we can get to something more useful. So, whilst much ink has been spilled discussing the nature of labor and value in Marx's labor theory of value, the nature of theory has often been neglected. Methodological problems or questions such as what kind of theory should the labor theory of value, LTV, be? That is, methodological questions are hardly ever asked. This is a serious omission, a kind of theory. It seems likely substantive theory can be positively influenced by being rooted in an appropriate method or mode of theorization. Then it can be negatively influenced by being rooted in an inappropriate mode. So positive and negative influence. As a substantive theory, the LTV, the labor theory of value, is no different. Rooting the LTV in an inappropriate, that is a deductivist mode of theorization, has a negative influence in the sense that it encourages the formulation of quantitative versions of the LTV that A, have severe problems, and B, lack explanatory power. Now, that may be a bad premise, but we'll try and work through this. Rooting the LTV in an appropriate, that is, contrasting deductivist mode with a causal explanatory mode, by contrast, has a positive influence in the sense that it encourages the formulation of qualitative versions of the LTV that A, lack such problems, and B, have explanatory power. The mode of theorization one employs, therefore, has a strong influence upon the version of the LTV one ends up with. Now, this presumes in some ways that these things are somewhat separate, but we'll work through this as well. The point is to sort of frame the theoretical problems because there is a range of theories that can be applied. And what this allows us to do is place empirical work in its rightful place as useful, important, overlapping with some other kinds of issues. And Paul Kochot, and a bunch of other folks are part of those who, worry about the classical political economy, and that an LTV, on the one hand, fits, but for many people, it is the bridge too far from a theoretical point of view. That is, there's too much. People have too much at stake, whether it's a kind of ideological frame, that is the identification with Marx, or and the kind of burden, or determinism that talking about labor can become. And this is a kind of literal figurative problem that you shouldn't worry about. I mean, you should worry about it, but it is, as some of the literature goes, is to be able to distinguish between labor and labor power. So let's move forward here. This is going to take a while to plow through this thing. And so now, given the fact that there are not only numerous versions of the LTV, which I just sort of implied, but also numerous methodological approaches, I employ two generalizing devices. First, our friend Steve I use Sweezy's distinction between quantitative and qualitative versions of the LTV, placing all versions in one or other of these categories. Second, I use the critical realist argument that basically there are only two modes of theorization, namely the deductivists and what I call the causal explanatory, placing all modes of theorization in one or the other of these categories. So now this may be, oversimplifying and creating a false dichotomy, et cetera, but let's just pursue this for the moment. The combination of theories and modes of theorizing can be schematized thusly. So if you can see this, there's a mode of theorization that is either deductivist or causal explanatory, and then in the vertical, the columns, a version of the LTV encouraged by the mode of theorization. So there's a mode of theorization, and then the application of the LTV to it. And making the simple division, as often is made, not unlike, and this is the oversimplification that we get in other fields, the difference between, for example, cultural studies and political economy approaches, as if one were qualitative and the other quantitative, and that's just not necessarily the case. But however, there is cross-fertilization, there is structural things that make qualitative, if you believe in kind of qualitative methodology, that give it a kind of structure and usefulness, in terms of causal explanatory ways, whereas in terms of deduction, and making it appear more empirical, whatever that means, quantitative verges on the side of the deductivist. So these are ways in which we can think about a particular version of the LTV, and the decision to go with modes of theorization that are relatively, simplified, but not made primitive. The paper consists of two distinct parts. Part one focuses on methodology. It opens with an introduction to the deductivist mode of theorization before turning to critical realism to A, establish a critique of this mode, that is the deductivist mode, and B, elaborate upon the alternative encouraged by critical realism, namely the causal explanatory mode of theorization. Part two applies the conclusions from the discussion of methodology to value theory itself. It opens with an exposition of the quantitative versions of the LTV, which is what we're sort of thinking about. I mean, that's the challenge that's been offered by some people who want to keep, sort of a Marxist point of view going. And as I've said before, you don't necessarily have to go explicitly talk about it that way. There's certainly enough people who indulge in theory and indulge in classical elements that you don't have to talk about Marx at all. And in fact, in some ways, you kind of coding, CODE, coding of the argument is kind of essential, considering the kind of sort of reactionary cultures that are sort of operating, or ideologically problematic elements. So anyway, it opens with an exposition of the quantitative versions of the LTV and explains why they can be conceived of as rooted in the deductive mode of theorizing. It then turns to critical realism to A, establish a critique of these quantitative versions of the LTV, and B, elaborate on the alternative qualitative versions of the LTV encouraged by the causal explanatory mode of theorization. In this way, methodological arguments emanating from the critical realist perspective generate both the critique of and the alternative to quantitative versions of the LTV, and facilitate an answer to the question of what kind of theory should the LTV be. So it's a kind of weird working backwards. Maybe it's overindulging the problem of what counts as a theory, but I think it's just useful to see that you can structurally separate out something that is deductive to do empirical work, and that you can do causal explanatory stuff to also do empirical work. So underlying this is not, it's not, I would assert, not trivial, but we'll see. Methodology. A deductivist mode of theorizing. Critical theorists like Tony Lawson, argue that the dominant mode of explanation in economics is the deductivist mode, wherein to explain something is to deduce a statement about that something from a set of initial conditions, assumptions, axioms, and a law, and or some other form of constant conjunction of events. Advocates usually claim that the deductivist mode offers more than just explanation. Amongst their claims, justified or not, are the following. So, deductivism allows consistent behavior to be deduced or predicted from antecedents. Some, but not all, advocate the empirical testing of hypotheses via predictive power. That's, the big deal. It's the importance to some people to, particularly in a social science way, to be able to provide not only explanatory elements, but some potential, testing to give us a kind of predictive power. Now, deductivism allows our thoughts to be presented systematically with clarity and with the perhaps spurious precision of mathematics. So this is that thing that, people will claim that, Marxism doesn't work well with math or the quantitative. And it's pretty clear if you read enough Marx that, this was a matter to him because considering how much time he spent doing all these arithmetical examples, that it's pretty clear that he wanted this to have a certain type of deductive power. So deductivism, because it presents an idealized version of reality. Now, idealized could be even contested there, but anyway, allows the relationships between certain important variables to be expressed simply and free from the clutter of other less important variables. Deductivism allows one to understand pathological states, i.e., disequilibrium, by comparing them to hypothetical non-pathological states, i.e., equilibrium. So you can already see here there's a classical thing that's there, or the classical versus neoclassical argument has that kind of element to it. Anyway, proving the existence of a unique solution or an equilibrium under simplified conditions gives economists a reason to believe that they are, quote unquote, on the right track, as Hausmann puts it. And this is a reference from Lawson. Generally speaking, then, and for reasons that are almost never spelled out, economists appear to believe that they've demonstrated something important about the real world when they can consistently deduce a set of conclusions from a set of initial premises. In virtue of the slightly wider nature of these claims, I refer to this mode as the deductivist mode of theorizing rather than mode of explanation. So this is a simple little move here, but it's an important one that is, is sort of carving out a place for explanation relative to theorizing. Now, whilst the deductivist mode of theorizing derives what intellectual supportive justification it does from positivism, which is the clear, problem of the 20th century for some people, and is a problem within economics, is its employment in economics is often extended way beyond any empirical level that most positivists would wish to sanction. Simply put, deductivism often generates purely algebraic or toy models, and Cavils writes on this, which are neither derived from nor tested against sense experience or empirical data. And that's generally the theoretical problem for many kinds of things that fall into this sort of theorizing. And there's no problem with that. There are disciplines that spend a fair amount of time on this stuff. Game theory, for example, does this, often with very little testing against sense experience or empirical data, because the math needs to work or whatever. Now, because Marxist economic theory is replete with such models, a little elaboration will pay dividends. So broadly speaking, there are two incorrect approaches to doing economic theory. The first approach, econometric modeling, is clearly rooted in sense data and hence empiricism. The economist constructs a model which hypothesizes the relationship between certain variables, that is, for example, a constant conjunction of events, then confronts the model with data. The model is deemed adequate if the hypothesized relationship is consistent with the data. Now, in the second approach, toy modeling, the economist constructs a purely algebraic model and makes no attempt to confront it with data. These models are often acknowledged by their advocates to be unrealistic and are legitimized in various ways, as noted above. Now, toy models appear not to be rooted in empiricism, appear not to involve the events of sense experience, and appear not to involve constant conjunctions of events. Now, this has led some people to argue that whilst these models are not immune from criticism, they are immune from the particular criticism offered by critical realists, which turns on a critique of constant conjunctions elaborated upon in section 1.2 below. This argument, I think, is incorrect. In toy models, scientific knowledge is generated by constant conjunctions of events, but because the latter are implicitly built into the model as a priori premise, they do not manifest themselves explicitly as in the case of the empirical relationships or econometric models. Now, this is why some have concluded, and Fleetwood is talking about this incorrectly, that scientific knowledge is being generated by something other than constant conjunctions of events. And so there's this question of ultimately of and maybe this is just a set of bad assumptions. But anyway, to explain how constant conjunctions of events are implicitly built into a model with as an a priori premise, considering the following example. In their classic paper on efficiency wage theory, Shapiro and Stiglitz attempt to predict when a worker will choose not to shirk. They write, and if and only if V n over E is less than or equal to V S over E, the worker will choose not to shirk. And what follows, I briefly sketch 4 reasons why constant conjunctions of events are implicitly built into this toy model as an a priori premise. Number 1, another way of expressing this situation is to write whenever event, that is X bracket Vn over E is less than or equal to Vs over E, close bracket, then event Y. So if X, then if event X, then event Y, that is shirking behavior occurs. True. Now, Shapiro and Stiglitz did not arrive at this conclusion via sense experience. Rather, it's spun out of the axioms, assumptions, and theorems of mainstream economics. The presumption, however, must be that under certain conditions, the hypothesized constant conjunction of events have a counterpart in reality and could even perhaps be even observed. Now, if this is not presumed, then the relevance of the model is undermined. Why should anyone bother modeling something that does not, however remote, express some feature of reality? Now, this, raises all kinds of other issues relative to sort of theoretical elements, undercuts the viability of, working things through in these somewhat mathematical ways. Number 2, the whole analysis takes place at the level of events as opposed to some sort of level of theory or method. If one event is observed or hypothesized, one can only seek its cause in terms of another observed or hypothesized event. It's if causality is implied, and if it is not, then the whole point of the model is in doubt, then so too are constantly conjoined events. That is, causality is elaborated upon in the following section. Part 3, epistemology presupposes ontology. So ideas, knowledge about how knowledge of reality is gained from a toy model are intelligible only via the presumption that the socioeconomic world is a certain kind of place, i.e., a place where, under certain conditions, whether Vn over E is less than or equal to Vs over E, then shirking behavior will follow. Now, if the socioeconomic world is presupposedly characterized by constant conjunctions of events, then building a model that expresses such regular behavior is a consistent way to obtain knowledge of it. So there's certain, you could argue that this is behavioral assumptions. Number 4, the centrality of the built-in event constancy can be seen by considering how useless a model would be if statements couched in terms of events were allowed, but event constancy was not present. Now consider how useless the following statement would be if and only if Vn over E is less than or equal to Vs over E, the worker will, on some occasions, choose to shirk. On other occasions, choose not to shirk. So if constant conjunctions of events are not implicitly built into toy models as an a priori premise, then nothing can be deduced from the antecedents. The model is useless on its own terms. That seems a little circular and a little tautological, but we need to sort of think about why this is being done. So once one understands that constant conjunctions of events are implicitly built into toy models, one could see constancy appearing in the following two general guises. Guise one, constant conjunctions form part of a toy model. For example, equals f f of x ceteris paribus. Here, the constant conjunctions of events that constitute this functional relation have been spun out of the basic axioms, assumptions, and theorems, and will not be tested against observed events. So you sort of, the implication, however, on pain of irrelevance, is that the constant conjunctions of events that are built into the toy model have a counterpart in reality. Now, guys, number two, the constant conjunctions can form part of an econometric model. That is, for example, y equals a plus b 1 x1 plus b2 x2 dot 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 bn xn plus v. That's sort of a relatively standard model with a kind of residual possible at the end. Here, the constant conjunctions of events may have been spun out of the basic axioms, assumptions, and theorems, may have been derived from the observation and recording of events, or may have been simply hypothesized. So, do you or do you not know how that's being derived? And this is that question between applied and pure, perhaps. The difference between A and B is that in the latter, guise number two, or whatever, A and B, is the alleged constancy will be tested against observed events. So ultimately, the problem is one of how is it that you structure your awareness or the relation to these sort of reality in that sense. What is significant for our purposes, however, is that in both of these cases, the mode of theorization turns fundamentally upon the alleged existence and ubiquity of constant conjunctions of events. Without event constancy, the deductivist mode of theorization does not get off the ground. Now, it is this, let me break here for a second. Event constancy is kind of the reason why conservatives and right wingers sort of they assume a world of some kind of bizarre constancy, which just simply does not exist. But they need it in order to build, some sort of model of moral superiority or hierarchy or power. All those things are there, but only because there's some assumption about event constancy. There is some sense that why don't you know this? And you must not know it because you're, one of some intersectional group that cannot appreciate this is a kind of standard argument, and hinges on cultural difference and a class, and race. All of those things are at work, but we're not going to deal with that for the moment. But I just wanted to make an aside there and note that that's kind of the issue that some brands of right-wing thought operate on. They presume, a world that somehow, and has been idealized, in fact, and I think you can see that in right-wing discourse, that there is some implicit kind of constancy, that, and you can see that built into whatever quote unquote privilege models operate in the world. They seem to not think that people who don't have that privilege or don't assume to have that privilege, because in fact it is I would assert, an ideological construction that that is always superior or hierarchically less questionable or something else. But you can always see that in right-wing discourse that, they assume something, whether it's God or something else, presumes a certain kind of constancy that I would assert you just can't assume. It's like step one, assume rationality. That's just not going to happen. Well, you can, but it really is, you look very silly when you do it, and that is the silliness that we're stuck with. 1.2, back to the text. Critical realist critique of the deductivist mode. Now, from the perspective of critical realism, Roy Bhaskar, etc., the deductive mode of theorization is inappropriate for two reasons. First, because the need to engineer closed systems generates a set of problematic and counterintuitive implications. I think you can see this, that what I was just saying about constancy is a certain, can also be defined as a kind of functionalism. And not a perfect functionalism, but a kind of functionalism. And second, the deductive mode of theorization lacks explanatory power. And that may be a problematic assumption in and of itself. But significantly, the root cause of these difficulties lies in the impoverished ontology presupposed by this mode. This is why people do social ontology, because it's pretty clear that when you look at, for example, an analytic philosophy, there are certain assumptions, certain ontological assumptions that don't quite fit with reality. And it has been the purpose, from a cultural point of view, to sort of say, well, you don't have ontology without some kind of social condition. I mean, you just can't. Otherwise, you've got religion or some other kind of thing. So, anyway, these will now be considered in turn. Sorry for the digression. Closed systems. Now, whilst constant conjunctions of events are clearly fundamental to deductivism, they are exceptionally rare phenomena. This is like swans and black swans, maybe. There appear to be very few spontaneously occurring systems wherein constant conjunctions of events occur in the natural world, and virtually none in the social world. You see, this is that thing, is that everything works for us in the cult, and you have to join our cult in order to be the beneficiary of these things, or to um, have the kind of perfection or more perfect social relations. Anyway, that is not to deny the possibility that constant conjunctions may occur accidentally or over some restricted spatio-temporal region, or be trivial. Now, but virtually all of the constant conjunctions of interest to science, including economics, occur only. Virtually all of the constant conjunctions of interest to science, including economics, occur only in experimental situations. Entire, research programs have been built on this premise. And on the one hand, it can be made mathematically consistent, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, what good is it if you can't derive from it some usefulness in that sense, or other kinds of values from it? But anyway, the point of experiment is to close the system by creating a particular set of conditions that will isolate the one interesting mechanism. You can already see that it's kind of reductionist. And if you're a monotheist, you can see exactly why people do that. They have to do that. That's the closed logic is really important. Otherwise, you don't get into whatever the cult is or whatever. Anyway, this mechanism is then allowed to operate unimpeded, and the results, the constant conjunctions recorded. For economists, constant conjunctions of events appear to be found only in the conceptual experiments that constitute closed systems. Herein, constant conjunctions are engineered by satisfying for closure conditions. So you can already see that you sort of hem yourself in with the logic, which is fine. I mean, it makes it work. it makes it, but this is the question of constant conjunctions that occur only in experimental situations, which allow us to get, useful or reasonable results, but are confounded when you try and actually do something with it. On the other hand, unfortunately, there's plenty of investment in pure activity, which is, of course, problematic in some of the sciences. Anyway, so number one, there are four closure conditions. The first closure condition is intrinsic closure conditions. That is, the internal state of the individuals that constitute the system must be engineered in such a way that when acted upon by causal factors, x1, x2, dot, 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 xn, the relevant individual always responds in the same a priori predictable way by initiating action y. So there's always something, a priori predictable. Most economic analysis is specified in terms of individual entities, for example, human beings or collectivities such as firms with an intrinsic state. How an individual responds to a causal influence depends in part upon this intrinsic state. For example, the response by a workforce vis-a-vis levels of output to the introduction of a performance-related pay, right? A pay increase, a pay rise, is likely to depend upon factors like expectations. Now, you can see that entire bodies of literature are built on this expectations issue. Anyway, the ICC, that is internal intrinsic closure condition, the intrinsic closure condition is satisfied when the individual is specified atomistically. Already you can see that in social science, this would be a problem that verges on and made problematic by some kind of methodological individualism, or at least that seems implied here, but maybe we're going too far. The atomistic individual is inert in the sense that when acted upon by a causal influence, it will initiate one predictable and constant course of action. And, with respect, you want that because you want your examples to work out. You get consistency, et cetera, et cetera. So, number two, the extrinsic, as opposed to intrinsic, closure condition ECC. The ECC, extrinsic closure condition, ensures that the system is completely isolated from external influences. Now, this is a more, radical, or it's just a different way of looking at the intrinsic, for example. This occurs when, number one, all relevant causal factors are internalized, so it becomes intrinsic within the system, or there remain relevant influences extrinsic to the system. Either number two, these factors are specified such that they exercise a perpetually, that's the important word here, constant influence, or number three, the elements within the system are isolated from their effects. So you can already see that, methodological theories that talk about different types of variables can be applied here. Anyway, extrinsic closure condition. There are numerous context-specific ways to satisfy these conditions. You can build an entire, taxonomy or typology from that. Number three, and you can see where there can begin to be overlaps with this, because now we see number three, an aggregational closure condition, ACC. So even if the ECC and the ICC, the intrinsic and the extrinsic, are satisfied, there is still no guarantee that when faced with relevant causal factors, the entity will initiate one predictable, unique, and constant course of action. This is problematic for some folks. This is because economic analysis often has to deal with individual entities combined into groups. I mean, it's just a problem. You could try to isolate individuals and, model in a way that, you have a nice little 2x2 matrix, and you're only dealing with 4 people, for example, or even just one person making a plus minus a choice in 2 modalities. But anyway, the whole point of the union, for example, that is, I assume this is a set issue, is to initiate a course of action that one individual acting alone would be unlikely to take. So this is also closing in. It is a kind of, closing in on stuff. The response of the workforce to causal factors, X1, X2, XM, or XN, will vary depending on the characteristics and distribution of individuals or subgroup of individuals that constitute that workforce. Internal constancy must be maintained over an aggregate of individuals. Now, one way of doing this is to focus upon the objectives of some appropriate subgroup. For example, the trade union as a collectivity is specified to behave as the leadership does. And you can see how that becomes problematic in, for example, trade unions or, other kinds of types of unionized activity, and you can see how that has an implication for how certain other socialized syndicalists, or I guess operismo, operate in that particular situation, that there is some underlying leadership assumptions that are assimilated. Well, anyway, that's for a whole nother set of issues. Anyway, the example of the trade union's collectivity is specified to behave as the leadership does. It's often the kind of, complaint about what counts as union membership. But anyway, number 4, the reducibility closure condition, the RCSC, that is subcondition, the reducibility closure subcondition. Finally, number 4, a subcondition needs to be applied to the ICC, the ECC, and the ACC to ensure that the number of potential courses of action an individual might initiate is reduced to 1, and hence is unique. You see already there's reductionism going on. You can see that perhaps methodological individualism has this issue, and is impossible to hypothesize, to operationalize in that sense. But anyway, deducing a unique solution requires that the system is fully specified via a series of auxiliary assumptions or assumptions of tractability. Now, these are merely technical assumptions whose sole purpose is to ensure the relevant functions are well behaved, hence preventing perverse outcomes. So there's some sort of conformity issue here as well. So, it's reducible, it's intrinsic and extrinsic, and you can have more than one, but ultimately they can be treated as one. You can see how you could this build into other kinds of theoretical problems. Now, whilst closed systems are necessary to generate the constant conjunction of events, they create as unintended consequences a series of problematic and counterintuitive implications arise. So, number 1, outside closed systems where constant conjunctions of events are not usually found, for example, reality, one would have to conclude that there are no laws. This would be tantamount to saying that nothing governs the non-constant flux of events in open systems. Science, including economics, then would be just simply a fruitless behavior. It's all chaos or whatever. Very few people believe that, but you can see how people can assume that in a variety of ways. Anyway, number 2. It is often the case in natural science that conclusions derived from experimental situations, for example, in closed systems, are successfully applied outside experimental situations, i.e. in open systems by comparison. Closed versus open systems. Unless you think that's unimportant, you can see that certain kinds of network behavior can operate in this way. Well, anyway, that's getting perhaps too far afield. This occurs not because the scientists have discovered a constant conjunction of events, but Because the causal mechanism at work has been uncovered and understood and can therefore be used even in situations where it doesn't generate constant conjunctions of events. So, because of A above, this state of affairs would have no valid explanation. Number three, deducing statements about the action of agents operating in a closed system and transferring them to the action of agents in the open system commits the fallacy called ignoratio elenchi. This elenchi. This entails assuming that one has demonstrated something to be true of X when the argument or evidence really applies to Y, which is not the same as X in some respect. So what is not the same is the existence and ubiquity of constant conjunctions of events. So there's, I don't know, is it Schrodinger, is it Schrodinger cats or something? But anyway, the various claims made by advocates of the deductive mode of theorization in support of this mode, some of which are mentioned in section 2.0, seem to commit this fallacy. Now, is it a specification problem? Is it, there's all kinds of stuff. Anyway, explanation. Following Lipton, I argue that to explain a phenomenon is to give information on the phenomenon's causal history. Now, phenomena have causal history. You have to sort of assume that, perhaps. And on this basis, I offer for three reasons why the deductive mode of theorizing lacks explanatory power. Now, note, of course, this explanation issue has a variety of ways in which it can operate. And this operates differently in a variety of fields. For example, historiography, for example, or, well, anyway, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a difference between explanation, from a pure science point of view, and explanation from a applied science point of view, perhaps, or maybe just simply a non-science activity. But anyway, number one, explanation is not merely efficient causality. This is you can think about this as, correlation issues. The causal history of a phenomena is not merely, if at all, one couched in terms of the event that happens to precede the phenomena, but in terms of the underlying transfactually operating causal mechanism, structures, powers, and relations. One does not, for example, adequately explain the event of my office light becoming illuminated simply by pointing to the event of flicking the switch that preceded it. Namely because, you could have a infrared sensor, I suppose. But anyway, yet this form of explanation is all that is available in the deductivist mode. The need to engineer closed systems means that the model has to remove, theoretically, of course, all potential causal factors that might violate the closure conditions. It is crucially important to grasp that once removed from the model, relevant causal factors cannot subsequently be recalled and offered as a part of the causal solution. So there's you could argue, I suppose, that's a temporal condition. Relevant causal factors are either included in the model, in which case they contribute to the causal explanation, or they are excluded, in which case they cannot make such a contribution. You can already see there are certain contingencies. Number two, explanation is simply not prediction. I mean, you may want it to be prediction, but that's an inference that you don't get to do. Prediction does not constitute explanation. The conflation of prediction and explanation is referred to as the symmetry thesis. Here, the only real difference between explanation and prediction relates to the direction of time. You can see how that can go. Explanation entails the deduction of an event after it has or is known to have occurred. Now, you can see where this can lead you to in even at certain points in history about, what really happened to whatever thing that was put in a box and blah, blah, blah. Prediction entails the deduction of an event prior to knowledge of its occurrence. One can, however, predict without explaining anything at all. You can just argue, whatever, propose. One can predict the onset of measles following the emergence of Koplik spots, but the latter does not explain measles. And you can see how this is operating in terms of anti-vaccine issues, and the being against vaccines is somehow analogous to being against government. Yeah, I mean, you can see where that could go. Anyway, number 3, explanation does not allow known falsehoods. If, as part of this causal story, one opts to include a known falsehood, or which amounts to the same thing, leaves out some important causal factor, that is, falsehood by omission, that's how Trump operates, then the explanation can immediately be objected to simply by pointing to this falsehood. Let me elaborate with a simple example. In explaining how my rubbish bags get ripped during the night, I might hypothesize that it is the work of a fox. Or I might hypothesize that it's the work of a ghost. The explanation involving the fox is advanced because I believe it is a real causal possibility. You put the bag out there and the foxes can get at it, coyotes can get at it. The explanation involving the ghost, by contrast, is advanced for the pragmatic reasons that I want to frighten my young nephew from staying away from the bin bag. So there's something else built into this. Whilst the explanation involving the fox might count as a valid explanation, the explanation involving the ghost, pragmatically useful as it is, only if, depending on how naive the young nephew is, has recourse to a known fiction and will not count as a valid explanation. One only has to reflect upon this for a moment to see this conclusion is self-evidently correct. If known fictions are allowed into explanation, imagine bizarre explanations that could be advanced. Now, you can see how this could be applied to all kinds of other craziness, the specter haunting Europe, etc. But that's going too far. In sum, then, the deductivist mode of theorization suffers from 2 major flaws. First flaw, a series of problems arise when analysis is couched in terms of closed systems where constant conjunctions of events are allegedly ubiquitous. When socioeconomic reality is an open system, when socioeconomic reality is an open system where such conjunctions are not found. The lack of constant conjunctions, of course, means that the main objective of positivist versions of science, namely predictive power, is redundant. Now, second, lacking explanatory power, the deductivist mode has no alternative but to substitute prediction, deduction, solution, determination, and calculation as the objective of science. The lack of explanatory power combined with the redundancy of predictive power, however, seriously damages deductivism. The objective it pursues is invalid, while the only remaining objective is out of its grasp. So I know this seems a little, perhaps dense, but these are attempts to define ultimately the difference between open and closed systems, a certain internal versus external logic, the problem of how you configure, sort of units within your analysis, etc. So you can see there's stuff implied by these theoretical positions that have already been implied, in terms of closure and conjunction and stuff. The impoverished ontology of deductivism, the problems affecting the deductivist mode of theorizing, can ultimately be traced back to ontology. Now, the point, let me break here for a second, and this is what I was just mentioning in terms of ontology, the difference between analytic philosophy versions of ontology and continental philosophy's version of ontology. the latter being at least one more open to social questions, the other not so much. Anyway, every time one makes a theoretical or meta-theoretical statement, one already has made explicit or implicit claims about the way the world is thought to be. It's already so. The prior section talking about open and closed, explicit, implicit, aggregate, all that stuff is kind of floating around. So, ontological commitments or presuppositions, one has an ontology. And it is these ontological presuppositions that render theoretical and meta-theoretical statements intelligible. For example, a theory couched in terms of individuals is rendered intelligible by the presupposition of an ontology of atomism. Such a theory would be rendered unintelligible by the presupposition of an ontology of holism. Now, lest you think that this is unimportant, this is the break in some ways between, I suppose, what Marx is thinking about in his doctoral dissertation. This idea of certain types of atomistic constructions coming up against other issues about holism that can contest that, and you can see that once you begin to take positions on this, you can see ideological conflicts and other things, young Hegelians, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, maybe that's just going too far. In what follows, the central features of the deductivist mode of theorization are clearly stated so that, step by step, the ontology that renders these features intelligible is identification. We're right there at the identification question. Once identified, the inappropriateness of this ontology can be ascertained. And furthermore, the way it's prepared in section 1.4 for an elaboration of the alternative, and by contrast, appropriate ontology that roots the causal explanatory mode of theorization. So this was a long way at getting, what the difference between a deductionist approach might be, and I don't know. Other people know more about this, but something quote unquote more inductive, perhaps. Anyway, so central to the way the deductivist mode of theorizing is operationalized, see, that word is really important to social science, are functional relations generalized as y equals f of x. Now, these can be expressed. Note that this is function and that function ideas are kind of important, and it's clear that it's not unimportant. These can also be expressed as laws and styled whenever event X, then event Y. Now, obviously that's one way of looking at it. Another way is to say maybe it's not so much a law, maybe it's just a rule. But anyway, if functional relations and laws are to have economic meaning as opposed to mere mathematical meaning, then they must imply causality. Causality renders them intelligible. The clear implication, for example, of writing Q equals F of P is that the quantity demanded or supplies varies with and is caused to vary by price. F of P equals price, Q equals quantity. And PQ, is kind of your standard way of thinking about in two dimensions, anyway, of how this stuff operates. Functional relations and laws are not, however, rendered intelligible by just any account of causality, but by one based upon constant conjunctions of events and deriving from Hume. The use of this notion of causality might arise from a conscious decision, or it might arise by default because other notions of causality that involve, for example, transfactually acting mechanisms and powers would render functional relations and laws unintelligible. Laws as constant conjunctions of events are thereby referred to as Humean. Now, you can sort of see where this is headed, philosophically speaking, and you can also see that there will be philosophical resistance to a Humean, construction of this stuff. So, if one were to discover a constant conjunction of events in the form of a Humean law or functional relation, one might claim, you could claim that there's that this is a science. There's scientific knowledge. It's because it's the constant conjunction of events that makes possible the deduction or prediction of some events from things that happened before, antecedents. Crucially, then, constant conjunctions of events drive the nomological, as opposed to ideological, the nomological machinery of the deductivist mode of theorizing. So you can see there's something going on. If it's nomological, then it is kind of, something more abstract than, you might not be able to see it. That's kind of how nomological machinery is, or would operate in this context. Anyway, scientific knowledge in the form of constant conjunctive events is only intelligible on the presumption that particular knowledge is derived via experiencing and subsequently recording unique individual atomistic events. These events cannot be other than the atomistic, since any connection or relationship between them would be impervious to sense experience. Otherwise, the nature of the connections would require prior explanation, thus undermining the explanatory power of sense experience. This is why it gets Humean. The ontology, implicit or explicit, is therefore one of atomistic events. So I leave it to smarter people to say how much this relates or doesn't relate to sort of Epicureanism. Anyway, ontology is confined to that which is experienced and is therefore of the atomistic events of sense experience. Because these objects are confined to experience, the ontology is empirical, thusly. And because these objects are thought to exist independently of one's identification of them, it is realist. This is the move that is made for critical realism, that there is independent existence out there. And this is one of the, it subsequently you could see how materialists might get onto this, that, there is only one world. There's no, sky fairy or something. Anyway, the ontology can therefore, or thereby, be labeled empirical realist. The deductivist mode of theorizing and the functional relations and laws that operationalize it are rendered intelligible, therefore, by the constant presupposition of causality as constant event conjunctions and an empirical realist ontology. So you're combining this event conjunction stuff with a certain set of beliefs, as it were, empirical realist ontology. So there, you're already kind of honing this down to how is it that we can talk about this stuff. Figure 2 illustrates that this empirical realist ontology consists of two fused domains referred to as the empirical and the actual. Now, even that distinction alone can be can have issues. So let's see if we can talk about this in a useful way. So figure 2 is an empirical realist or flat ontology. This is an ontology without, with no bells and whistles. So it has two domains, an empirical domain of experiences and perceptions, and an actual domain of events and action. And you can sort of see where this is headed from a Marxian point of view, and this distinction, I think, is important. And if you sort of buy into that there is a difference between the empirical and the actual, and that you can, not necessarily bifurcate, but you could sort of wall off experiences and perceptions from events and actions, knowing full well that events and actions are experienced and are perceived. You see, this is where it gets crazy. You need to sort of say, well, what makes these things, what makes the entities the same or different? And this is, there's kind of a flat distinction, or perhaps a dichotomy and that alone can be have issues as well. So what is presumed coexistent with what is, or what could, under certain conditions, be perceived? Causality as constant event conjunctions means that if some event is perceived, one can only seek its cause in terms of another perceived event. There is nowhere else to seek a cause, because any other domain in this ontological spectrum is ruled out. The result is not only an impoverished ontology, one restricted to the domains of the empirical and the actual, but also a set of implicit ontological claims about the world that are, in fact, at odds with the way the world really is. Now, unless you think it's unimportant, I would assert to you that this is one of the kind of issues how cults operate or don't operate. But anyway, the world does not consist merely of events and their experiences, nor does it consist merely of constant conjunctions of these events. This is a serious state of affairs because it means the very building blocks out of which theories are constructed fail to express reality. So, there's other contingency issues here. So we've looked at, kind of a way we can think about deduction. Now, we can think about causal explanatory things. And, we may still get hung up on that actual and, empirical sort of differences. But anyway, so this is section 1.3. Being fully cognizant of the problems that can arise from a lack of ontological reflection. A lack of ontological reflection, that alone has other issues. Critical realism takes ontology seriously. The following sections demonstrate how critical realism can generate an alternative ontology, an alternative mode of theorizing, and ultimately, this is the goal of this whole business here, an alternative version of the LTV. The labor theory of value. See, we didn't talk about it for a long period of time because he was, like most theorists, we try and get the whole thing to sort of work out before we try and plug it into something. Firmly rejecting constant conjunctions of events as most unlikely features of social reality and thereby abandoning the notion of causality as mere regularity, the critical realist is free to seek the cause of an event elsewhere in the ontological spectrum. Now, that alone, it sounds spatial. It sounds something else going on. Attention turns away from the flux of events, that is, constant events or otherwise, and towards this is why it becomes theoretical. Causal mechanisms, social structures, this is Marx, right? Powers and relations that govern. This is all what Marx is sort of, cogitating about. It is the crux of his issues with the young Hegelians, among other things, and other issues. I suppose you could even argue that the issue with Dühring has a similar, well, maybe not. Anyway, rather than the ontology being restricted to the fused domains of the actual and the empirical, the critical realist adds. Now, this is where, for some people, this can just get funky and maybe problematic. It adds another domain, namely the metaphoric deep, that is in figure 3, the deep, and let's just think this is unimportant. Deep structure questions arise. They're clearly in the modern, looking for it. The deep structures are not the deep state, but you could say even the people who argue for a deep state have actually some of this kind of problematizing at work. It's just that it verges on paranoia, and we're not talking about paranoia. We're just talking about, as the anthropologists would talk about it, thicker description. So figure 3 illustrates this stratified ontology. So we started with empirical and actual, and now we've moved to that thing that for some people, this is how, post-war, and I don't think it's so much post-war. I think it was floating around, and you could say it goes back into stuff in the 19th century, and there's other issues. But anyway, deep structures, mechanisms, powers, and relations. See, this is the challenge that, or the difference between left and right, is that, all that business we were looking at before with closed and closure and closed systems and logic and blah, blah, blah. You can see that those are deep problems that are hitherto unrecognized or unincluded So when, people who are more conservative or right wing or believe in certain, whatever constructions, certain cultural constructions, they presume that everybody knows what you're talking about. So it's like when Christians talk about faith, and it's really not, faith is faith, but there's this whole set of things that comes when, people of that particular ideological stripe talk about it. And that can be the issue of, you know, why, there's a Alphasarian thing, and there's a whole bunch of other things you can talk about. But figure three, a structured ontology. So we began with a certain viewpoint about experiences, perceptions, events, and actions. And we now enter or include or don't exclude, which is the difference between including and not including and not excluding, structures, mechanisms, powers, and relations. And you can automatically see, Marx is thinking about this. They think about it: production, circulation, circuits. That's all going on in his head. And you can see how other people would accept that relative to the kind of need to have to analyze these sets of deep relations in a time when everything seems a little nuts. So in an open system, these domains are typically out of phase with one another meaning with out of phase with one another meaning cannot map, that is say, the effect of a power or causal mechanism to its manifestation at the level of events. So the important point here is that domains are typically out of phase with one another, meaning one cannot map the effect of a power or causal mechanism to its manifestation at the level of events and perceptions. This is because powers and causal mechanisms act transfactually, so that once set in motion, they continue to have an influence, even if other countervailing powers and mechanisms prevent this influence manifesting itself. You can see where this would be an issue if you're thinking about the difference between work, labor power, and then ultimately a wage. You can see kind of how this might happen. An airplane has the power to fly even when it remains locked in a hangar. This power acts transfactually. In Marxist economics, transfactuality underpins Marx's notion of tendencies. These mechanisms and powers are always in operation, even when empirically the rate of profit is rising. So, Marx is just simply describing a dynamic system, and that's why he talks about tendencies: tendency of the rate of profit to fall or decline. The causal mechanisms and powers that combine to generate the tendency of the rate of profit to decline act transfactually. These mechanisms and powers are always in operation, even when empirically the rate of profit is rising. So, in other words, you could say, in one place, rate of profit rises. In another place, and in fact, I would assert empirical reality does that, it could be falling. And this is the spatial, ultimately, this is the spatial and ultimately anomalogical, but, whatever, that David Harvey is sort of working on. That is a spatio-temporal difference. And which is why people try to quote unquote annihilate space, because there is this difference that operates in whatever. They are transfactual due to the operation of other causal mechanisms, such as technological advances acting in a countervailing manner. We should look at Fleetwood's other writing on this. But anyway, now, not only is the ontology adopted by critical realism stratified, so you see the difference. Now you have three levels. It is also transformational. Bhaskar, Roy, establishes the possibility of a transformational ontology from an investigation into the nature of society. Whilst traditionally, most commentators recognize that society consists in some sense of agents and structures, this is sociology, right? The debate centers, this is, I suppose, a reflexivity argument. Debate centers upon the way they interact. With the transformational model of social action, Bhaskar enjoins this debate. Nothing happens out of nothing. Agents do not reproduce and or transform a set of pre-existing structures. Society continues to exist only because agents reproduce and or transform those structures that they encounter in their social actions. Now, hopefully you can see why this is anthropological, particularly in the modern sense, um, that, something else is going on. And it reveals itself, it structurally reveals itself. That's why anthropology becomes important. It is unfortunately also why, some people want to just simply segregate anthropology with sociology and with geography and a bunch of other things. Even though each area has now built, pretty serious theoretical infrastructure. Anyway, every action per society continues to exist only because agents reproduce and or transform those structures that they encounter in their social actions. Every action performed requires the pre-existence of some social structures which agents draw upon in order to initiate that action. You see, in the other model, the deductive model, there is some assumption about it being more closed or more a priori or something. And in doing so, reproduce and transform them. For example, finally, for example, communicating requires a medium. For example, language. And the operation of the market requires the rules of private property. So both things are going on. There's a medium and a market, and there are rules, and there's a language and language is rule governed in that sense. You can see how all this fits together. That is, communicating is not simply, doing a single interaction, or duality in that sense. Rather, it is, a system of interactions. And the issue of how markets operate is because there is a difference between stuff you got and stuff you want to keep and stuff other people want, which is one way of looking at it. It's another thing about the way, libertarians think about, they want to be able to have the freedom to do stuff, but they don't want people taking their stuff. So, this is a big problem for a lot of libertarians. They want to retain their wealth, but they have no means by which to prevent, small arms is not going to always defend your stuff. Anyway, this ensemble of social structures, according to Bhaskar, simply is society. It just seems, that's one way of thinking about it, a simple way. Now, as Bhaskar observes, people do not create society for it always pre-exists them and is a necessary condition for their activity. Rather, society must be regarded as an ensemble of bricolage, an ensemble of structures, practices, and conventions which individuals reproduce and transform, but which would not exist unless they did so. So there's some, it exists outside of you, but you have to, there's some presumption of interaction. Anyway, society does not exist independently of human activity. This is the error of reification. And that's worth a whole other set of questions. But it is not the product of it. This is the error of voluntarism. There's a lot loaded in this one sentence. That is, society does not exist independently of human activity, the error of reification, but it is not the product of it. So it doesn't exist independently, but not necessarily, there's an agency issue here, sort of. Now, the transformational principle then centers upon the causal mechanisms, structures, powers, and relations that are the ever-present condition and the continually reproduced and or transformed outcome of human agency. Agents acting purposefully, or consciously, unconsciously draw upon and therefore thereby reproduce the mechanism, structures, powers, and relation which govern their actions in daily life. So there is something there. And, under certain arguments, you could say, well, it's evolution, it's how evolution operates, right? It is why, you know, uh, from a eugenic point of view or genetic or evolutionary point of view, certain things happen. And you got to know, you have plenty of things that can explain that or describe that. So that's kind of there. And therefore, there is a switch in the mode of theorizing. Operating with a stratified and transformational ontology, the emphasis of investigation necessarily switches from the domains of empirical and actual and the ensuing event patterns observed or hypothesized to the domain of the deep and the mechanisms that govern these events. Investigation switches from the consequences, that is, from outcomes or results in the form of events and their pattern, things that conjoin, I suppose. The outcomes or results in the form of events and their patterns of some particular human action to the conditions that make that action possible. So you can already see, there's something contingent, contextual, something else going on. You know, I suppose you could explain it via some sociologies, the kind of habitus described by some folks. But anyway, as Bhaskar puts matters, looked at this way, the task of the various social sciences is to lay out the structural conditions for various conscious human actions. For example, what economic processes must take place for Christmas shopping to be possible, but they do not describe the latter. So, you can see the falsehood or the implication, however, both satirical, parodied, contradictory, of a war on Christmas. But anyway, because of the openness of socioeconomic systems, the transfactual nature of the causal mechanism, consequences or outcomes cannot be deduced or predicted. That's pretty important there. The causal mechanisms that govern this human action can, however, so while you can't deduce it, that's the deduction problem, or have predictable power, you can uncover them and explain them. So you're trying to, you're trying not to imply that you're doing deduction, and you can imply also that it doesn't necessarily have predictable power. I mean, you could try, and that's certainly, I suppose, useful in some ways, but that's not guaranteed. Explanation is substituted for deduction, prediction, solution, determination, and calculation as the objectives of science. So this explanatory thing, this revelatory thing, should be a scientific objective. And it's worth saying a little bit more here about explanation. The causal explanatory mode of reasoning makes significant use of a particular kind of explanation, namely contrastive explanation. Now, Lipton describes this with exceptional clarity. Now, what gets explained is not simply why this, but why this rather than that, this and that. We may not explain why the leaves turn yellow in November, but only, for example, why they turn yellow in November rather than in January, or why they turn yellow in November rather than turning blue. So this, you can see what's going on. On the one hand, you could argue that, oh, it's just relativism. Well, it's more than that. It is looking for specific, more specific contrasts. It has a certain structure to it. It's not simply arbitrary, or actually it's arbitrary, but not random. Um, and there is a difference. So whilst contrastive explanation will be employed in section 2.3, you see, we're just not rolling along. Note 2 points. First, the nature of explanation is far richer than that utilized in the deductive mode of theorization, where explanation reduces to efficient causality, prediction deduction, that is, prediction/deduction, and often requires the introduction of falsehoods. Now, this is, in order to get something to work, you may have to falsify. I mean, you need to have a falsifiable, construction. I mean, you could argue that that's one of that what he means here by falsehood. Second, one can now understand the reason for calling the mode of reasoning causal dash explanatory. In this mode, to explain a phenomena is to give information about relevant causes. This information is typically about the underlying transfactually operating causal mechanisms, social structures, and powers. That's sort of what goes on in qualitative analysis. And the argument from that point of view is that there is enough structure there to give it empirical, viability, at least at one level of analysis. And, it may be problematic to give out degrees in it, but, it's methodologically, valid for all kinds of populations. But anyway, it also expresses the main objectives of science. Namely, and this is the difference, not unlike the difference between labor and labor power, this is explanatory power, which is not the same as explanation, right? There is something else. All right, so I'm going to stop here because we're not even to value theory yet. But these are important distinctions that I would hope that someone can sort of think about, and that, well, in the next little event of this sort, we'll transformational model of social action, variety of other things. Transformational models, so part 2, value theory, which appears on page 56, will be where we'll start at the next thing or whatever. If we don't get to it, we'll at least work through an outline of this crazy thing, and hopefully that will suffice as well by Wednesday. So I hope you have found this sort of useful. It is for some, it's a distinction without a difference, perhaps for some people, and it merely is simple, sort of fooling around with language. But once you begin to see that it looks at the kind of subtlety of differences, the things that make heterodox thinking, on the one hand, problematic in terms of precision, open it up in terms of, productivity in terms of meaning. So anyway, that's kind of where I was headed with that. And I hope you got something out of this. Perhaps you didn't. So we're gonna go back to the meeting, turn off the live stream, and close the share.